So far away, Lucas, what's your favourite made-up word from Lord of the Rings?
Probably ring.
So that's it. We did a funny bit to go here, but Lucas ruined it. Few authors are as responsible for as many contributions to the English language as J.R.R. Tolkien, an unsurprising fact given that he was a seasoned word nerd of the highest order. Perhaps the most curious quirk of language Tolkien is responsible for, though, is the word dwarves, which he accidentally made the default plural for everyone's favourite fictional race of tiny mountain-dwelling hammer-swingers.
Like, it doesn't really surprise me to hear you say that Tolkien is a massive word nerd.
Oh yeah, he was a turbo word nerd of the highest order. Very famously so, in fact. And the famous story told about Tolkien that demonstrates like how much of a hard-on he had for just the concept of languages as a whole is the fact that he reportedly created all of the languages spoken by the fictional races of the Lord of the Rings novels and its surrounding universe before he even started writing the books, and in fact only wrote the books as a framing devices for the languages he made up for fun. Fucking hell, is that like, that's some nerdy ass nerd shit, isn't it?
That's beyond nerdy ass nerd shit, yeah.
Like, he created fictional languages and dialects for elves and then made a story to like justify the time he'd spent doing that. Like, he even went as far to have created a fictional language for like the Ents, a fictional race of tree people.
That really don't show up that often either.
I think they might show up more in the books, but like in the movies they show up for like what, 1 or 2 scenes and they speak English. And before we continue, I'm going to apologise to the Tolkien nerds out there. My knowledge of the series is a little bit rusty. It's been a while since I watched the films, and it's been even longer since I tried to read the books. I'm really sorry. Those are some dense-ass, heavy books. Because, Lucas, you can confirm this. We have a mutual friend who's a big Tolkien nerd, yes?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And he had all of the Lord of the Rings books, and I don't even know how to pronounce the Silmarillion?
Silmarillion?
I'm sorry, folks at home. And he had that, and he handed it to me. And I felt, like, oh, is this all the books in one? I went, no, Karl, it's the first one. I'm like, oh! I was wounded. And I opened it up and tried to read the first page and just went, I'm sorry, but I can't. I'll just watch the extended edition of the film, and I think that's enough.
Yeah, I know, like, my girlfriend Jenna has the whole Lord of the Rings, like, book on our shelves, just like the...
On the reinforced shelf.
And it's just, God, I picked it up and it's like, you could easily murder a person with this book.
So I just wanted to get that out of the way now. I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings from afar. I appreciate it and everything it's done for like the genre of fantasy, which it basically helped invent. But my pronunciation of certain words and my recollection of specific things is going to be a little bit hazy, and I hope people can forgive that. Because obviously I'm hoping my enthusiasm for them will at least show through.
Are you going to really ask Lord of the Rings fans for forgiveness, Karl?
I'd hope so, because from what I've encountered, Lord of the Rings fans tend to be kind of chill, at least compared to fans of other like nerdy interests.
Yeah,
like,
true.
They've got nothing on anime fans, I mean, up their own ass. I distinctly recall I was watching like some Dragonball Fighter Z footage, like a tournament. Like, these like the best players in the world for this game. And I scrolled down to the comments, the guy's like, look, like the gameplay's good, but I'm sorry, I can't watch it if it doesn't have the Japanese voices. Like, fuck off! Like, crawl out of your own arse. Like, did you know you can get a degree in just Tolkien?
Really?
Yeah, you can go study Lord of the Rings and Tolkien at university and get a degree in it. People have got degrees in this.
I mean, that's awesome.
Serious business. I think we got a little bit sidetracked there, but I just wanted to talk about my favourite scene with the Ents, where they attack Saruman's tower, and you just see the one that catches on fire and dunks its head in the water, because I thought that was a neat little detail.
Okay, well, if he made all these like worlds and languages and just all of these different words, like, how nitty-gritty and detailed did he get on this?
Well, I think my favourite example of the attention to detail Tolkien had when it came to crafting the languages of like the fictional races he invented, you have to go with the Dwarves, which are the topic of today's video, for which he invented a specific type of sign language only used by the Dwarves who worked the massive furnaces of Moria because they were too loud.
Oh my god.
That's how detailed he got. That's how like nitty-gritty he got with this type of shit, because he was that much of a nerd. And he invented all this before he started writing the books. It's like when you are that dedicated to your nerdiness, like it goes all the way around from being uncool to being like the coolest shit ever.
Exactly.
Because like it's so impressive that he did this. But speaking of the dwarves, whilst Tolkien admittedly did not invent or come up with the idea of tiny bearded men who live underground and are masters of metalworking, with him largely being inspired for that idea by Norse mythology, he is the one who like combined a lot of those ideas into one and popularized the modern idea of dwarves themselves.
Okay.
Like to the point where they are basically a default fictional race of the fantasy genre alongside elves, which he also popularized.
Okay, so I believe the title of this video is going to be like that he invented dwarves?
Yeah, and I just said that he didn't come up with the concept of them. So I have to admit, folks at home, there's a little bit of a bait and switch to the title here. Like, whilst Tolkien did not come up with the idea of dwarves, the word dwarves is absolutely something credited to him. And to explain what I mean by that, it's important to understand that before Tolkien arrived on the scene, the plural for the word dwarves, in regards to tiny fictional men who live underground and smith weapons and armour, was dwarfs, like FS at the end. However, when Tolkien started writing The Hobbit and later Lord of the Rings, he pluralized dwarves as dwarves, with a VES at the end.
Right, so the original plural was FS, but he used VES?
Yes, and it's not really clear why Tolkien did this, because, as I mentioned, he was a huge lover of the language, and something we'll get into in a moment is that he literally helped create language as we understand it today in a very, very definitive fashion. And there are a couple of theories, and one is that he simply made a mistake, because there is a rule in the English language that any word that ends with an F, the plural of it will be FS, with a couple of exceptions, which include words like half, halves, VES, wife, wives, and, oddly enough, elf, elves. Which leads into the second theory, and that is that Tolkien did not like that dwarfs and elves didn't match on the page. Mm-hmm. So, out of frustration with the fact that the words did not visually match one another, just started pluralizing dwarfs as dwarves, so that dwarves and elves look similar on the page, because he was a big fan of words that did that.
And I'm really glad that he didn't just go with elves.
He went the other way and went elves, because elves doesn't sound as cool, does it? Elves sound so fucking cool, as do words like elven, which is also incorrect and is something that Tolkien did. And again, the theory is that he just didn't like that on the page the words look different, because a famous story about Tolkien is that he thought the most beautiful word in the English language was cellar door, as in the door to a cellar. And you know that's not bullshit, because if you say cellar door over and over again, it starts to sound like a location in The Lord of the Rings. Like cellar door, you add that little, the door. Like, imagine Christopher Lee saying that, I can believe
Yeah.
it's somewhere Bilbo goes on holiday.
Did he not have any sort of editor to just correct him on this, though?
Oddly enough, he did. When he submitted early drafts for The Hobbit, which features many, many dwarves, Tolkien's editor kept correcting dwarves to dwarfs, and included a note that said, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the plural of dwarves is dwarfs, to which Tolkien responded by saying, I wrote the Oxford English Dictionary, which sounds like a boast until you realise Tolkien actually did help write the Oxford English Dictionary. Reportedly being given the hardest words to find the etymology of, because he was that much of a fucking nerd, he liked looking that shit up. And I believe one of the words he is responsible for defining in the dictionary is walrus. Which was reportedly given to him because they couldn't figure out what the etymology of the word was. Well, that Tolkien dude, he's a huge nerd, just give it to him. Well, Lucas, let's just imagine for a second you are an editor back in the day and you receive an early draft of The Hobbit. Okay. And you correct dwarves to dwarfs, and you send that back to Tolkien, and in response he says, I wrote the fucking dictionary, don't correct me. And you go and check the dictionary and see that, holy shit, Tolkien did help write the dictionary. Would you correct him again?
I don't think I would.
But reportedly, the editor stopped making that correction after that fact. But it did happen again when he submitted The Lord of the Rings, which also got corrected, which Tolkien also got pissed off about and just said, look, it's dwarves. I know it's right. Fuck you.
Okay, and at the end of the day, Tolkien was wrong. Did he ever admit to being wrong about this whole dwarf thing?
Yeah, so the important thing for folks having to realise, like, Tolkien was wrong. The plural of dwarf is dwarfs. He was wrong. And for whatever reason, he ended up changing it, whether it was a mistake or just like his own personal preference, right? The way the words looked. He was wrong. And a couple of years after the fact, he did sheepishly admit that, my bad on that one. It was a personal bit of bad grammar, and quite a shocking one at that, for someone as seasoned in the study of languages as myself. But by that point, Lord of the Rings books were out, and the concept of dwarves, I should say, was popularized. As I said, well, Tolkien didn't invent them, he did popularize them and put them firmly in the minds of the public, so there was no way to correct it. So even though he was wrong, he was so confident about being wrong that none of his editors had corrected him. Those books had made it out into the world, and then the public had just assumed that he was right. So by that point, because language is an ever-changing beast, dwarves is now an acceptable pluralization of dwarf, if not the de facto one for most people in regards to, the fictional dwarves. And it's just... You've got to respect it, haven't you?
Yeah, you do.
And just to end on for the people who were screaming about it in the comments, I know that Tolkien would later defend his wrong pluralization of dwarfs, because he did some research on it and found out that the historical plural for dwarf was dwerros, or something like that. There's like some really obscure word that had completely fallen out of use, like dwerro or something to that effect. So even then, the dictionary was still wrong, but he was wrong as well, but the dictionary was also wrong, so I guess it kind of works out. But just that thing of I was so wrong for so long that fuck it, I'm right now. Bollocks to it. I wrote the dictionary. Deal with it. And Lucas, there's just something about the words used in fantasy that makes them so fucking cool. Even if it is just like a minor difference in spelling. Like the word magic, yeah, fair enough, it's like magic. But when you put that K at the end, it's like, that word invokes like a wizard in robes, casting all sorts of spells. It's like Final Fantasy games. So I'm casting fire. Oh, okay, fire. You summon some fire, that's pretty cool. But when it's Fire Arja, and you're like, that's awesome! That's the sickest shit. Or thunder. No, Thundaga. That's the shit I do like. So are there any words or terms from fantasy that you just adore?
A real weird one that I don't necessarily adore, but I always just find hilarious is from the Elder Scrolls games, and it's just skooma.
The drug, skooma.
Yeah, skooma.
Oh, man. The Elder Scrolls games have such interesting lore.
They do, yeah.
I love the Argonians. Just these weird lizard people, they're fucking sick. And they live in, I think it's the Black Marsh, which sounds awesome. It's like the naming conventions for like fantasy are incredible. Like Lord of the Rings, Mount Doom. Really? You've got all these other names, you call it Mount Doom. Like, you can tell that that's the day that Tolkien just stopped giving a shit. But you go to stuff like Game of Thrones, and like all the names, like the Flower Prince will always stick out in my mind. I don't even know who that character is, but I know his title because it sounds sick.
The Onion Knight.
The Onion Knight! Oh, it's so good! And the thing is, I know that's in Game of Thrones, but when I hear Onion Knight, I always think of Final Fantasy. Because there's like an onion knight in that. I'm not sure in what capacity. I remember distinctly when in Final Fantasy X, you can get an onion knight weapon for Lulu, and it's like her ultimate weapon. It's a little onion knight. Speaking of Final Fantasy, like cactuars. Little cactuar. Oh, it's awesome! And they throw needles at you, and they do backflips. And speaking specifically about Game of Thrones, which is probably the closest modern parallel we have to Lord of the Rings. In regards to it's a huge, big... Unfortunately, with a TV show, the books are still good.
They are, yeah.
But do you have any favourite naming conventions or terms from that book?
I do like the name of the dragons. The dragons are all cool.
Drogo. That's just dragon spelt weird.
That is true, that's true.
You like dragon, like Khaleesi, like Daenerys Targaryen. Like, Daenerys Targaryen is a fucking sick name, and then all their titles. Like, the
titles
are
amazing.
The Breaker of fucking... What? Like, when you know the Breaker of Chains is approaching, like, your city, just give up.
Yeah.
I'm honestly surprised that there aren't more episodes of that show where you have, like, the leader of a city that Daenerys is approaching, getting a raven that just says, give up. That's it. They just open it up, give up. It's like, oh, fuck.